The smell of my daughter's charred teddy bear was still clinging to my skin when Evelyn Vance walked into that courtroom, like she was stepping onto a red carpet at the Oscars, wearing that same jagged, synthetic smile she used when she was bleaching my late wife's garden or embezzling 60 grand from our elderly neighbors. And for a second, the air just left my lungs because this woman, this absolute predator of the suburbs, had no idea that her biggest mistake wasn't in Oppos. Just burning my life to the ground. It was never bothering to find out who I actually was before she struck the match. See, to Evelyn, I was just, in quote, the quiet widower in 4B, in quote, a convenient punching bag she could bully to make herself feel like the queen of the cul-de-sac. But she didn't end Oppos. T realized she'd just committed federal arson against a man who'd spent 20 years as a high-stakes prosecutor, the kind of guy who knows exactly how to turn the gears of the system until they crush everything in their path. And as I sat there in the silence of that courtroom, I realized she hadn't into Oppos. T just taken my house. She'd handed me the fuel to incinerate her entire criminal empire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me take you back to how a peaceful life in Oak Creek turned into a scorched earth war for survival. 3 years ago, my world was small, quiet, and mostly held together by Scotch tape and the memory of my wife, Sarah, who'd passed away from a sudden illness that left me raising our daughter, Maya, alone in a house that felt too big and too empty all at once. I'm Silas Thorne, a man who spends his days buried in legal briefs and his evenings trying to remember how to braid a 10-year-old's hair without making her cry. And our neighborhood, Oak Creek, was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, where the biggest drama was whose dog pooped on whose lawn, or why the streetlights were flickering again. We had an HOA, sure, but it was a ghost, a relic from the 90s that nobody cared about until Evelyn Vance rolled in with her white Range Rover and a clipboard that felt like it was made of cold-pressed spite, and within a week, she declared herself the, in quote, safety and aesthetic coordinator, in quote, a title she basically pulled out of thin air because our actual HOA board hadn't an Oppos. T met since the Clinton administration. She started small, issuing these little yellow, in quote, non-compliance, in quote, notices for things like the color of someone's curtains or a slightly overgrown hedge. But it was the way she did it, that clack, clack, clack of her designer heels on the pavement at 6 a.m., the way she'd stare at your house like she was measuring it for a casket, that started setting people on edge. My first run-in with her was over Sarah's roses, these beautiful, stubborn climbers that Sarah had spent years nurturing, plants that were literally the last living thing I had that she'd touched, and Evelyn stood there on my sidewalk, smelling of expensive lilies and cheap cigarettes, telling me that the, end quote, floral density, end quote, was a, end quote, breeding ground for invasive pests, end quote, and gave me 48 hours to rip them out. I actually laughed in her face, and told her that unless she could produce the legal bylaws of a registered 501c3 nonprofit HOA with a quorum-voted mandate, she could take her clipboard and find a new hobby. And that was the moment I saw it, that tiny flicker in her shark-like eyes that told me I had into Oppos. T just annoyed her. I'd challenge her throne, and for a woman like Evelyn, that was a declaration of war. The retaliation started with the, end quote, towing ring, end quote, which was this brilliant, disgusting little scheme she'd set up with a local company called Blackwood Recovery, owned by a guy named Miller who happened to be the brother of our local precinct captain, and suddenly, cars started vanishing in the middle of the night. My sister came to visit from out of town to help with Maya's birthday, and we woke up to her car being hoisted onto a flatbed because Evelyn had, in quote, retroactively, in quote, decided that guest parking required permit she hadn't in Oppos, T issued yet. And when I went down there to stop them, Miller just gave me this dead-eyed look and told me it was, in quote, cash only, $500 to drop the hook, end quote, while Evelyn watched from her balcony, sipping a green smoothie like she was watching a movie. I realized then that this wasn't in Oppos. T just a bossy neighbor. This was a syndicate, a small-town protection racket where she'd pick the most vulnerable people, the single moms, the retirees who didn't into Oppos. T speak great English, the people she knew couldn't into Oppos. T fight back, and she'd bleed them dry with, in quote, fines, in quote, and, in quote, fees, in quote, that went straight in her pocket. But it got dark, real dark, when she realized I was building a case against her, because I'm a prosecutor and my brain is wired to find a paper trail, So I've been spending my nights at the county clerk's office discovering that our HOA wasn't oppos. T just inactive. It had been legally dissolved 5 years ago for failure to file tax returns, meaning every penny she collected was straight-up fraud. One morning, I walked out to find her standing in my rose garden with a gallon of industrial-strength bleach, just systematically pouring it onto the roots of Sarah's flowers. And when I screamed at her to stop, she just smiled that vacant, terrifying smile and said, and quote, "I told you, Silas, pests have to be eradicated for the health of the community," end quote. And as I watched those leaves turn black and curl up like dying spiders, I felt a part of my soul just go cold, a predatory stillness that I usually only felt when I was cross-examining a killer, and I knew I wasn't oppos. T gonna just sue her. I was going to dismantle her life piece by piece. She must have smelled the danger because she went for the throat. She targeted Maya. I got a call from the school nurse saying Maya was having a massive panic attack because 2 men claiming to be, in quote, home inspectors, in quote, had shown up at our house while she was getting her backpack, telling her that the house was, in quote, unsafe, in quote, and that she might have to go live somewhere else while they, in quote, fix the violations, in quote. They'd taken pictures of her room, they'd gone through her cabinets, all under a fake work order Evelyn had signed herself. And when I got home and saw my daughter shaking, clutching her inhaler, asking if we were going to be homeless, I felt a level of rage that I didn't in oppos. Tino, a human being could contain without exploding. I filed for an emergency restraining order that night, which was granted by a judge who knew me. But Evelyn was 3 steps ahead. She showed up at my house the next day with the police, crying crocodile tears, telling them I'd threatened to, in quote, in her, in quote, and that she was the one who needed protection, and because she had the precinct captain's brother on her payroll, they served me with a counter order that basically paralyzed me from being able to even look in her direction without risking arrest. That was her peak, her moment of triumph where she thought she'd won, but she didn't end oppos. T realized I'd spent that week on the phone with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and the IRS. Because if there's one thing the government hates more than anything, it's people stealing their tax revenue. And we'd found out that Evelyn wasn't an oppos. T just a bully. She was a desperate, drowning debtor who owed nearly $100,000 in back taxes and was using the neighborhood as her personal ATM. We had wiretaps, we had surveillance, we had it all, and the net was closing, but Evelyn, being the true sociopath she is, decided that if she couldn't and oppos, T rule the kingdom, she'd burn it down. And on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in the middle of a closing argument downtown, my phone started screaming with alerts from my home security system. The cameras I'd hidden in the trees that she didn't in oppos, T know about. And I watched in real time on my screen as her cousin, a guy with a rap sheet, longer than my arm, smashed my basement window and tossed in a lit flare soaked in accelerant. By the time I got there, the street was a wall of black smoke, and the heat was so intense it was melting the siding off the neighboring houses. And I found Maya standing on the sidewalk with our neighbor, just staring at the orange flames licking the windows of her bedroom, the place where all her mother's things were kept, the place where we'd finally started to feel safe again. I stood there, the ash falling on my shoulders like gray snow, and I didn't in oppos. T cry, I didn't in oppos. T scream. I just looked across the street and saw Evelyn sitting in her Range Rover, just a few yards away, watching the fire with this look of absolute, serene satisfaction, and she actually had the audacity to nod at me, a tiny, respectful, in quote, checkmate, in quote, gesture before driving away. But here's the thing about, in quote, checkmate, in quote, you have to make sure the other king is actually trapped, and she had an oppos. T realized that my, in quote, work from home, in quote, files she wanted to destroy were all backed up on a secure cloud server, or that my hidden cameras had captured her cousins. Face in 4K resolution, or that the FBI was already sitting in a van 2 blocks away, recording her phone calls as she told her cousin, and quote, good job, now get to the border, and quote, they picked her up at a gas station an hour later, still smelling like smoke and expensive perfume. And when they searched her car, they found the ledgers, the fake notices, and the, end quote, hit list, end quote, of neighbors she was planning to extort next. 6 months later, we're in that courtroom, and she's sitting there in a cheap suit, her hair finally showing its gray roots because she has an end oppos. T had a stylist in lockup, and the prosecutor plays the audio from the wiretap. Her own voice, clear as a bell, saying in quote, "I Don and Oppos. T care if the kid is inside. Silas needs to learn that nobody says no to me," end quote. And the gas that went through that room was like a physical wave. And even her own lawyer just looked down at his shoes like he was contemplating a career change to gardening. The judge didn't and Oppos to even blink when he handed down the sentence. 15 years in federal prison, no parole, and a restitution order that stripped her of every asset she owned, including that Range Rover and her precious house, which was sold to pay back the neighbors she'd robbed for years. The house is rebuilt now, and it's different, stronger, with a bigger garden where the neighbors all came together to plant new roses for Sarah. And every time I look out that window and see the kids playing in the street without looking over their shoulders, I realize that sometimes the only way to save a community is to let the rot burn itself out so something better can grow in the ashes. But it makes me wonder, because I see stories like this popping up everywhere lately. These little tyrants who think a clipboard gives them the right to play God with people and Oppos. Slaves? And I have to ask you, if you were in my shoes, if someone tried to take the last memories of the person you loved most, how far would you go to get your pound of flesh? Is it enough to just let the law handle it? Or is there a part of you that would and Oppos? To be satisfied until you saw them lose everything just like you did? Drop a comment below. Tell me your HOA horror stories, or tell me if you think I went too far. I'm reading all of them because I think it's time we started talking about who really owns our neighborhoods. Don and Oppos. Forget to subscribe because this was just one street in one town, and trust me, there are a lot more monsters hiding behind white picket fences.